los que están sanos.
The term slave trade often conjures images of the transatlantic trade that transported Africans to the Americas. Yet, another harrowing chapter of history details the capture and enslavement of Europeans, predominantly by North African pirates. This lesser-known ordeal, referred to as the white slave trade, exposes a brutal era where thousands of Europeans were seized from their coastal homes or ships, destined for a life of hardship and servitude in far-off lands. The following 10 facts reveal the terrifying truths of this trade. Number 1. The Barbary Coast Raids. The Barbary Coast, stretching from modern-day Morocco through Algeria, Tunisia, and reaching as far as Libya, was notorious for its corsairs. These pirates, operating under the aegis of their respective North African states, roamed the Mediterranean, Atlantic coastlines, and even reached as far as Iceland. Their primary intent was not just to plunder, but to capture Europeans for the slave markets of North Africa. The mere mention of these corsairs sent chills down European spines, leading coastal towns to fortify themselves and ships to sail in convoys for protection. Between the 16th and early 19th centuries, these pirates embarked on countless raids. One of the most audacious of such incursions was the raid on the Icelandic village of Grindavik in 1627, where corsairs captured and enslaved close to 400 inhabitants. Such was the reach and terror of the Barbary pirates. The frequency of these raids was such that coastal villages across Spain, Italy, and Portugal were often abandoned, with survivors moving inland to evade the terrifying prospect of capture. The corsairs' ships were swift and well-armed, making them a formidable threat on the seas. European naval powers, even with their vast resources, found it challenging to counter the nimble tactics and intimate knowledge of Mediterranean waters that the corsairs possessed. The pirates primarily targeted weaker vessels, such as merchant ships and fishing boats, ensuring a lesser risk and a higher probability of success. Over time, the capture of larger vessels and even naval ships wasn't uncommon. The objective of these raids was clear: human cargo. The corsairs, upon capturing a vessel or raiding a village, would meticulously select their captives based on age, health, and skills. The younger and healthier you were, the more value you held in the North African slave markets. Skills were equally vital. Artisans, sailors, or those with specific trades often fetched a higher price. Gender, too, played a role in determining one's fate. While men were primarily destined for hard labor, women were often relegated to harems or domestic servitude. Children were a prized catch due to their potential for indoctrination and assimilation into Muslim society or military service as janissaries. Upon landing on the North African coast, the newly captured slaves would be paraded in the slave markets. Potential buyers would examine them meticulously, haggling over prices as one would over livestock. Their previous lives, identities, and families were stripped away, with many never seeing their homelands again. The magnitude of the Barbary Coast raids and their impact on Europe was profound. Coastal communities lived in perpetual fear, and the Mediterranean Sea became a dangerous expanse for European mariners. Amidst the geopolitics and economic interests of the era, the personal tales of suffering, despair, and resilience of those ensnared in the raids remained etched in the annals of history. Number 2. Extent of European slavery. Historians have grappled with the task of estimating the number of Europeans enslaved by the Barbary corsairs, with figures ranging significantly. However, many concur that over the span of 3 centuries, anywhere between 1 million to 1.25 million Europeans were taken into slavery by the North African pirates. This staggering number provides insight into the scale and intensity of the Barbary slave raids. While the Mediterranean coastal towns bore the brunt of these incursions, the corsairs' reach was not limited to this region. They ventured out into the Atlantic Ocean, striking at unsuspecting targets along the coasts of Spain, Portugal, France, and even England and Ireland. The sheer audacity of their raids meant that no European coastal town felt entirely secure. For instance, in the early 17th century, the corsairs raided Baltimore, Ireland, capturing almost its entire population and transporting them to a life of slavery in North Africa. Slavery in Barbary was distinct from other forms of servitude practiced globally. It was not a system designed to sustain an agrarian economy as seen in the Americas. Instead, the European slaves in North Africa were forced into various roles: galley slaves, laborers, concubines, guards, and even administrators. Cities like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli thrived and expanded using the labor of these European slaves. The grand fortifications, docks, and public works that these cities boasted during this period were built on the back of enslaved Europeans. But beyond the physical labor, the psychological toll of this form of enslavement was immense. Slaves were often paraded through streets upon arrival, symbolizing both a victory over European powers and the might of the North African rulers. Many were branded or tattooed, marking them as property. They lived under the constant threat of punishment, which could be brutal in public, serving as a deterrent to others who might harbor thoughts of rebellion or escape. The stories of these slaves resonate with harrowing personal accounts. Some documented their experiences, leaving behind narratives filled with pain, longing, and the dream of freedom. Among them was Miguel de Cervantes, the famed author of Don Quixote, who was enslaved for 5 years after being captured at sea. The sheer extent of European slavery at the hands of the Barbary corsairs is a testament to the strategic and economic significance it held for the North African states. It was a well-organized, state-sponsored enterprise, with vast networks and systems in place to facilitate the capture, sale, and management of slaves. For Europe, it signified a period of vulnerability and a challenge to its maritime dominance, prompting various responses, ranging from military campaigns to diplomacy, in a bid to safeguard its citizens and shores from the ever-looming threat of Barbary piracy and enslavement. Number 3. Treatment and conditions of the slaves. Life for the Europeans captured and enslaved in North Africa was defined by hardship, cruelty, and uncertainty. The fate that awaited them post-capture was diverse, often contingent upon their perceived value, skills, and the whims of their captors. Upon arrival in North African ports, the enslaved were paraded for public viewing. This humiliating spectacle served dual purposes, showcasing the might and wealth of the captors and priming the captives for the brutalities they would soon endure. Their European identity was often effaced. Many were given new names, branded or tattooed to indicate their status and ownership. For the men, the most dreaded fate was to be consigned to the galleys. As galley slaves, they were chained to the oars of ships, forced to row for excruciatingly long hours. The conditions were horrific: exposure to the elements, minimal food and water, cramped spaces, and the incessant lash of the whip for those deemed too slow or defiant. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease were rife, and death in these circumstances was a frequent, if not merciful, release. Those not assigned to galleys were often put to hard labor. This involved constructing fortifications, buildings, and infrastructure, or working in quarries and mines. The intensity of this labor, coupled with scanty nourishment and frequent physical abuse, left many broken in spirit and body. Women faced a different kind of hell. Many were forced into domestic servitude, subjected to the whims of their masters and mistresses. Others, especially the young and beautiful, were forced into harems. Here they lived in a state of perpetual vulnerability, their worth determined by their appearance and the pleasure they could offer their owners. While the physical torment was undeniable, the psychological torture was equally harrowing. The enslaved lived in a state of constant uncertainty. Some were fortunate to have benign masters who treated them with a modicum of kindness or respect, while others were less fortunate, enduring daily cruelties. Escape was a tantalizing but perilous dream. Those caught attempting to flee faced severe punishments, often public, to deter others from harboring similar ambitions. Amidst this bleak existence, pockets of resistance and resilience emerged. Some slaves managed to form clandestine groups, offering each other solace and support. Some even embraced their new culture and religion, finding in it a way to navigate and negotiate their existence. There are tales of those who rose through the ranks, leveraging their skills or building relationships with the powerful, eventually earning their freedom or amassing influence. However, for the majority, life was a continuous cycle of labor, fear, and degradation. They bore their suffering in silent dignity, their hopes pinned on potential ransoms or diplomatic interventions. The stories of their endurance and tenacity serve as poignant reminders of the human spirit's capacity to persevere amidst the most dire of circumstances. Number 4. Economic drivers of the trade. The white slave trade was not a random act of piracy or mere maritime lawlessness. It was an organized and state-sponsored enterprise. At its core, the primary driver was economic gain. The North African states of the Barbary Coast recognized the profitability of this trade and embedded it as an integral part of their economies. For the Barbary states, capturing and selling European slaves provided a steady influx of wealth. The slave markets of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli were bustling centers of commerce, where human lives were bartered for gold, silver, and other valuables. The proceeds from these sales flowed into the state coffers, funding military expeditions, infrastructure projects, and the lavish lifestyles of the ruling elite. Beyond direct sales, the captured slaves were invaluable assets for their labor. As the Barbary states expanded and fortified their territories, they needed a vast workforce. The enslaved Europeans filled this gap, constructing walls, buildings, and other infrastructure. This state-driven development, underpinned by slave labor, allowed these North African cities to grow and flourish, enhancing their regional influence. Additionally, the European slaves, with their diverse skills and expertise, introduced new trades and crafts to North Africa. Skilled artisans, carpenters, masons, and other professionals were highly valued, often fetching higher prices. Their contributions enriched the Barbary economies, introducing new products and improving existing ones. Another significant economic driver was the system of ransoms. Many European families, communities, and even states were willing to pay considerable sums to secure the release of their captured kin or subjects. This became a lucrative enterprise for the Barbary rulers. They developed a sophisticated network of negotiators and brokers who liaised with European representatives to haggle over ransoms. These negotiations could stretch over years, all the while accruing more wealth for the captors. Furthermore, the threat of the Barbary raids and their demonstrated capacity to capture Europeans was also leveraged diplomatically. European powers, keen to safeguard their shipping lanes and coastal towns, often entered into treaties with the Barbary states. These agreements typically involved paying tributes or annual protection money to ensure their ships and coastlines were left unmolested. Such tributes became a consistent revenue stream for the Barbary states, further entrenching the economic significance of the white slave trade. The Barbary Coast's white slave trade was not merely an act of aggression or cultural domination. It was a calculated economic strategy, deeply embedded in the socio-political fabric of the North African states. The trade's profitability and its multifaceted economic benefits ensured its persistence for centuries, despite numerous European attempts to curtail or end it. Number 5. Prominent slave markets in North Africa. The capture of Europeans by Barbary corsairs was just the initial phase in the cycle of the white slave trade. Once taken, the captives would be transported to key cities on the North African coast, where bustling slave markets awaited their arrival. These markets not only represented places of transaction, but were emblematic of the economic vitality and power dynamics of the Barbary states. Algiers, the capital of modern-day Algeria, stood out as the epicenter of this trade. The city's slave market was one of the largest and most frequented in the region. Strategically positioned along the Mediterranean coast, Algiers was a natural harbor and a hub of activity. The market in Algiers was often the first destination for captives, where they would be paraded, evaluated, and sold. The city's rulers and elites, along with wealthy merchants, frequently attended these sales, seeking slaves for labor, personal service, or to populate their harems. Tunis, the present-day capital of Tunisia, was another major center. Its market, while not as large as Algiers, was equally notorious. The captives brought to Tunis often faced a similar fate, with their value determined by age, health, appearance, and skills. It was not uncommon for European dignitaries to visit Tunis, not for diplomacy, but to negotiate ransoms for their captured compatriots. Tripoli, located in modern-day Libya, was the third vertex of this unholy triangle. As with Algiers and Tunis, Tripoli's slave market thrived on the influx of European captives. The city's proximity to the southern European coast made it a strategic point for corsairs returning from their raids. In Tripoli, the demand for slaves extended beyond the city's boundaries, with buyers often coming from the interior regions of North Africa, seeking slaves for various roles. While these three cities were the principal centers, several smaller markets dotted the Barbary coast. These markets, while not as grand or well-known, played a crucial role in the regional slave trade's distribution network. They facilitated the movement of slaves into the hinterlands and ensured a steady supply to meet localized demands. The prominence of these slave markets in North Africa underscores the trade's significance in the regional economy and society. They stood as testament to the power and influence of the Barbary states, a stark reminder of a period when European lives were commodities traded under the African sun. Number 6. The role of corsairs in the trade. The Barbary corsairs, also known as Barbary pirates, were the lifeblood of the white slave trade, ensuring its perpetuation and profitability. These seafarers, formidable and fearless, were the primary agents responsible for capturing Europeans and channeling them into the North African slave markets. Originating from the term corsair, which translates to raider, these pirates were not mere rogues or lawless brigands. They were often state-sanctioned privateers, operating with the explicit approval and backing of the Barbary states. Their ventures were not just driven by personal gain, they were integral to the economic and political machinations of their patron states. The corsairs' modus operandi was both strategic and opportunistic. Their vessels, sleek and fast, were designed for swift attacks and rapid getaways. Typically, they lurked in key maritime routes, pouncing on unsuspecting European merchant ships. These raids were meticulously planned, leveraging the corsairs' intimate knowledge of the Mediterranean's winds, currents, and coastlines. While the seas were their primary hunting grounds, the corsairs were not averse to land raids. Coastal towns and villages across Europe, states from Spain to Italy and even as far north as Iceland, lived in perpetual fear of corsair incursions. These raids were audacious, with pirates often venturing deep into European territories, capturing inhabitants, and vanishing before any significant defensive response could be mounted. Their expertise extended beyond combat and capture. The corsairs were adept negotiators, often securing hefty ransoms for high-value captives, such as nobles or skilled artisans. They understood the emotional and political value of their captives, leveraging this knowledge to extract maximum profits. The corsairs were the linchpin of the white slave trade, executing the capture, transportation, and sale of European slaves. Their role was not just that of pirates or traders, but of geopolitical actors, influencing diplomacy, commerce, and power dynamics in the Mediterranean for centuries. Their legacy, entwined with tales of adventure, treachery, and bravery, serves as a stark reminder of a period when the Mediterranean was a crucible of conflict, commerce, and cultural exchange. Number 7. Ransoms and treaties. The human cost of the white slave trade was incalculable, but amidst the grim tableau of suffering and commodification, a complex system of ransoms and treaties emerged. This intricate web of negotiations and diplomacy underscored the multifaceted nature of the trade, moving beyond mere piracy into the realm of international relations. The act of ransoming was as old as the institution of slavery itself. Once ensnared in the Barbary coast's slave markets, many Europeans became pawns in a high-stakes game of diplomacy and commerce. Families, desperate to reclaim their loved ones, would marshal significant resources, contacting intermediaries familiar with the nuances of North African negotiations. Religious organizations, notably the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, played pivotal roles, often acting as brokers, raising funds, and negotiating for the release of Christian captives. Ransoms were not standardized. They varied based on the captive's perceived value. Skilled craftsmen, scholars, or those of noble birth could fetch exorbitant sums, while others, deemed less valuable, were often left languishing, their freedom price too high for their families to afford. This system of ransoming became so institutionalized that set tariffs were sometimes established, with captors providing detailed bills of sale and inventories of their human merchandise. While these treaties provided intermittent respite from hostilities, they were far from permanent solutions. The cycle of raids, ransoms, and renegotiations persisted, a testament to the complex interplay of power, commerce, and diplomacy in the Mediterranean. In reflection, the system of ransoms and treaties offers a lens into the intricacies of the white slave trade. Beyond the immediate brutality and human suffering, it was a trade deeply embedded in the geopolitics of its time, shaping and being shaped by the broader currents of European and North African relations. Number 8. Impact on European coastal cities. The specter of Barbary corsair raids loomed large over European coastal cities for centuries, with the white slave trade casting a long, inescapable shadow. This perpetual threat had profound implications, not just for the individuals ensnared, but for the very fabric of European coastal societies and their urban landscapes. One of the most immediate impacts was the air of apprehension and vulnerability that permeated these coastal areas. Towns from Spain to Italy and even distant Iceland lived with the knowledge that a corsair fleet might appear on the horizon at any time. This was not mere paranoia. Many towns were raided multiple times over the years, their populations decimated or living in fear of capture. In response to this constant menace, many European coastal cities underwent significant transformations. Architectural and urban planning reflected the region's defensive priorities. Tall watchtowers, known as torres, started dotting the coastline, particularly in Spain and Italy. These structures served as early warning systems, allowing for the rapid dissemination of alerts in case of incoming corsair vessels. Furthermore, massive fortifications, walls, and battlements were erected or strengthened around vulnerable towns. Such defensive structures required significant investment, and their presence is a testament to the extent of the corsair threat. Beyond mere physical changes, these fortifications influenced urban life, often restricting growth or diverting resources from other, potentially more productive endeavors. Yet it wasn't all negative. The corsair threat indirectly fostered a sense of unity and collective purpose in some regions. Coastal communities often banded together, pooling resources for defense, ransoms, or reprisal expeditions. Moreover, the shared threat paved the way for increased cooperation and coordination between different European powers, sowing the seeds for more cohesive maritime strategies. The white slave trade's impact on European coastal cities was multifaceted, leaving an indelible mark on their physical, economic, and cultural landscapes. The echoes of this era, from the watchtowers to the tales of corsair raids, still resonate today, a testament to a time when European coasts lived under the shadow of North African sails. Number 9. Efforts to end the trade. The white slave trade's endurance was not without resistance. From its inception, European nations grappled with its consequences and sought various means to curb or eliminate the threat posed by the Barbary corsairs and their benefactors. Another strategy was undermining the trade's economic underpinnings. European nations sought to bypass the Mediterranean entirely, seeking alternative trade routes. The age of exploration and the establishment of maritime routes around Africa diminished the Mediterranean's centrality, indirectly impacting the profitability of the corsair raids. Religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, played a crucial role in humanitarian efforts. Organizations such as the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, dedicated to the redemption of captives, not only negotiated ransoms, but also applied diplomatic and moral pressure on European monarchies to take decisive action against the trade. By the 19th century, the tide began to turn more decisively against the Barbary states. The growing military and technological superiority of European powers meant that the balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted. A series of defeats, treaties, and the increasing European colonial interest in North Africa further eroded the Barbary states' autonomy and their ability to sustain the trade. Efforts to end the white slave trade were protracted and multifaceted, reflecting the trade's complexity and its deep entrenchment in the Mediterranean's geopolitics. The eventual decline of the trade was not just the result of military victories, but a confluence of economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian endeavors, which together brought an end to one of the darkest chapters in Mediterranean history. Number 10. lasting effects on European consciousness. The Barbary slave trade, with its harrowing tales of capture and bondage, has left an indelible mark on the European consciousness. Its aftermath resonated not merely as a historical episode, but influenced the socio-cultural and psychological fabric of European societies, shaping perspectives and narratives for centuries to come. At the personal level, families across Europe were directly impacted. With thousands taken into bondage over the centuries, the ripple effect of individual traumas coalesced into a collective memory. Tales of separation, heroism, and sometimes reunification became woven into family histories, passed down through generations. These stories perpetuated both the anguish of loss and the hope for return, serving as cautionary tales for coastal communities. Literature and art became mediums to express, reflect, and sometimes exaggerate the menace of the Barbary corsairs. From plays to novels, the figure of the formidable corsair and the tragic European captive became recurring motifs. This artistic representation often straddled the line between reality and romanticism, with the corsair sometimes depicted as an exotic, honorable foe, and at other times as the epitome of cruelty. Furthermore, the trade subtly influenced European perceptions of the other. The constant interaction, albeit mostly adversarial, with North African Muslims shaped European views on Islam, ethnicity, and culture. While there were stories of cruelty and conflict, there were also tales of camaraderie, conversions, and cultural exchanges, complicating the monolithic image of the corsair and his world. The legacy of the Barbary white slave trade is multifarious, touching various facets of European consciousness. It's a testament to the enduring power of historical events to shape cultural narratives, personal identities, and geopolitical strategies, leaving an impact long after their immediate relevance has faded.